the night was dark, the kind that swallows the stars and leaves only the moon as a lonely sentinel. In a small candle-lit room, Lemuel Haynes sat hunched over a wooden desk, his quill scratching furiously against the rough parchment. The flicker of the flame cast shadows that danced across the walls, giving the room an almost otherworldly feel. Haynes was a man of few words, but his thoughts were a tempest, a storm of ideas and convictions that threatened to break free at any moment. He paused, his eyes scanning the words he had just written. "It is a lamentable consequence of the fall," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. The fall, the moment when humanity's perfect state was shattered, leaving behind a world marred by sin and suffering. Haynes believed that this fall was the root of all evil, including the institution of slavery. He knew that the white men who claimed to fight for liberty were often the same men who held other human beings in chains. Haynes was no stranger to the weight of these chains. Born to a white mother and a black father, he had grown up in a world that saw him as neither fully one nor the other. He was a man of color in a society that valued whiteness above all else. But he was also a man of faith, a Calvinist who believed in the sovereignty of God and the depravity of human nature. This duality shaped his worldview, making him both a fierce critic of the status quo and a passionate advocate for change. He continued to write, his hand moving with a sense of urgency. It cannot be thought impertinent for us to turn one eye into our own breast for a little moment and see whether through some inadvertency or a self-contracted spirit we do not find the monster lurking in our own bosom. The monster he spoke of was the sin of hypocrisy, the sin of claiming to fight for freedom while denying it to others. Haynes knew that the success of the revolutionary cause was at stake on this very question. If the colonists could not see the contradiction in their actions, they would be doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Phillis Wheatley, a young woman of African descent, shared Haynes' concerns. Despite being a slave herself, Wheatley had become a celebrated poet, her words reaching the ears of the most powerful men in the colonies. She, too, saw the hypocrisy in the revolutionary rhetoric. In her letter to George Washington, she wrote with a mix of admiration and veiled plea. She hoped that even the most eminent slave owner in the colonies would ultimately apply the revolutionary ideology of equality and liberty to people of African as well as European descent. But Washington's response was disappointing. He praised her poetry, but ignored her deeper message, a sign that the fight for true freedom was far from over. Haynes and Wheatley were not alone in their critical patriotism. They were part of a growing movement of black and white New Englanders who saw the revolution as an opportunity to reimagine what kind of society the new nation could be. Jonathan Edwards, Jr. and Samuel Hopkins, both clergymen, also spoke out against the moral inconsistency of the revolutionary era. They argued that the concept of divine providence should not be used to justify the cause of independence without a critical examination of the nation's actions, especially regarding the treatment of Native and African peoples. Haynes' own experiences as a Minuteman during the Battle of Lexington had only deepened his resolve. He had seen the bravery of his fellow soldiers, but he had also seen the injustice that underpinned their struggle. In his poem about the battle, he wrote, "Thrice happy they who thus resign into the peaceful grave, much better there in death confined than a surviving slave." The true survivors, he believed, were those who remained in chains, their freedom stolen by a society that claimed to value liberty above all else. Wheatley's poetry and Haynes' sermons were more than just words. They were calls to action. They demanded that the colonists look inward, to examine their own hearts and souls, and to recognize the sin of slavery for what it was, a violation of the very principles they claimed to fight for. The Revolutionary Era was a time of great promise, but it was also a time of great peril. The new nation could either build a foundation of true freedom and equality, or it could erect a house of cards, built on the lies and hypocrisy of its founders. As Haynes put down his quill and blew out the candle, the room fell into darkness. But the fire of his convictions burned brightly, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed change. The struggle for a just and equitable society was far from over, but Haynes and Wheatley were ready to fight for it, one word at a time. The Great Awakening was a time of intense religious revival in the 18th century, and it touched many lives across the American colonies and beyond. In New England, the movement saw many people leave the congregational churches to form new Baptist groups. One of the most influential figures in this shift was Isaac Backus. Backus was a farmer from Norwich, Connecticut, who had a powerful conversion experience after hearing the revivalist preaching of Eleazar Wheelock. In 1746, Backus left his congregational church and joined a separatist evangelical group. He later became a pastor of a Baptist church in Middleborough, Massachusetts, and was a strong advocate for the separation of church and state, fighting against taxes that supported state churches. Nathan Cole, a farmer from Connecticut, also had a life-changing experience during the Great Awakening. He traveled 12 miles to hear George Whitefield preach in 1740. Cole's conversion was profound, but he struggled with the assurance of his salvation. Eventually, he joined a Baptist church in the late 1770s, becoming part of the growing evangelical movement. In the Middle Colonies, the revival was strong among the Presbyterians and the Dutch Reformed Church. The Tennant family, originally from Scotland, played a significant role. William Tennant, the patriarch, established a training school for ministers called the Log College in Pennsylvania. His son, Gilbert Tennant, became a leading revivalist, inspired by the emotional preaching of Theodorus Frelinghuysen, a Dutch pietist minister. Frelinghuysen's emphasis on repentance and conversion deeply influenced Tennant's own ministry. Further south, in colonies like Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, the Church of England was the established religion. However, the Anglican Church's influence was weak in the rural backcountry, where many people felt neglected. This opened the door for the Baptists, who saw significant growth in the region. Shubal Stearns, his sister Martha, and his brother-in-law Daniel Marshall moved to North Carolina in the 1750s and formed a Calvinistic Baptist church at Sandy Creek. Their efforts led to the establishment of thousands of Baptist churches throughout the South by the 1770s. In Britain, Calvinism was strong in Scotland and Wales. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church was the established religion, but there were internal conflicts. The moderate party, which favored a more refined and less theological approach, clashed with the evangelical high flyers who supported revivalism. Ministers like Thomas Gillespie, John Maclaurin, and James Robe led some of the largest revivals in Scottish history, such as the ones in Cambuslang and Kilsyth in 1742, where thousands of people gathered for week-long communion services. The news of these revivals spread to the Netherlands, where a minister named Hugh Kennedy published a Dutch edition of James Robe's account of the Cambuslang and Kilsyth revivals. This sparked a spiritual resurgence in the Netherlands, particularly in the town of Nietkirk, where over 1,300 people experienced deep conviction of their need for salvation. In Wales, the revivals were led by Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland. Harris, known for his eccentric preaching style, and Rowland, a more level-headed Anglican curate, worked together to promote local awakenings. However, their partnership was strained by theological differences, and they eventually parted ways. They reconciled in the early 1760s when a revival broke out in Lengitho. In Germany, Pietism, a movement that emphasized personal faith and moral living, laid the foundation for early German evangelicalism. Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf, a leader of the Pietist group known as the Moravians, sent missionaries around the world. Johann Adam Steinmetz, a Lutheran Pietist, supported revivalism by translating and publishing evangelical works, including Jonathan Edwards' A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. Steinmetz's edition included a preface that smoothed over theological differences to make the revival account more accessible to German Lutherans. Evangelicalism was not limited to white male clergy. Women and people of color also played significant roles. Sarah Osborne, a school teacher in Newport, Rhode Island, organized women's societies and prayer meetings that included free blacks and slaves. She was instrumental in bringing Samuel Hopkins, a disciple of Jonathan Edwards, to serve as her church's pastor. Jonathan Edwards' wife, Sarah Pierpont, was known for her deep piety. During a revival in Northampton, she experienced a powerful spiritual episode that left her physically exhausted. Edwards, a moderate revivalist, noted that such emotional responses could be a natural effect of the Holy Spirit's power. African Americans and Native Americans also found a place in the evangelical movement. Phillis Wheatley, a slave in Boston, became a celebrated poet and expressed her faith in her writings. Lemuel Haynes, the first African American to be ordained in a major white denomination, became a prominent pastor and theologian, advocating for the Federalists and speaking out against Jefferson's democratic republicanism. The Great Awakening was a time of profound spiritual change, touching the lives of people from all walks of life and across different regions. It showed that the message of salvation and personal faith could transcend social and racial boundaries, uniting people in a common quest for spiritual renewal. The story of the forced displacement of Native Americans is a dark chapter in American history. In the 1670s, a conflict known as King Philip's War made things even worse. Before this, some missionaries like Thomas Mayhew and John Eliot had some success in converting Native Americans to Christianity. But after the war, most Native Americans were wary of these efforts. However, a few found the revivalist message appealing. One of the most important converts was Samson Occom, a Mohegan who experienced a spiritual awakening during the Great Awakening in 1741. Occom trained to become a minister under Eleazar Wheelock in Connecticut, and was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1759. Occom then went on a mission to raise funds for Wheelock's School for Native Americans. He traveled overseas and managed to collect a large sum of money, £12,000. But when he returned, he was heartbroken to discover that Wheelock had used the money to start a school for white boys, which later became Dartmouth College. Despite feeling betrayed, Occom remained committed to his Christian faith and helped establish a Christian Native American community called Brothertown in upstate New York. As evangelicalism grew in the 18th century, leaders began to disagree on how to interpret revivalism. Two of the most famous leaders, John Wesley and George Whitefield, had a significant dispute. They were friends at Oxford University, where they both attended Bible study meetings. Whitefield, who had a talent for dramatic preaching, convinced Wesley to try preaching outdoors. This led to the formation of early Methodism. Wesley and Whitefield, however, had different theological views. Wesley believed in free will and that salvation was available to everyone. He argued that if God had predestined only a select few for salvation, it would make preaching pointless. Whitefield, on the other hand, was a Calvinist who believed in predestination. He thought that God had already chosen who would be saved. This disagreement led to a split in Methodism, with Wesley's branch emphasizing free will and Whitefield's branch adhering to Calvinist beliefs. Wesley also had disagreements with other evangelicals. One of these was James Hervey, a popular author whose books were widely read. Hervey wrote about the Calvinist idea that Christ's righteousness was imputed to the elect. Wesley strongly criticized this idea, calling it poisonous. This caused tension between Wesleyan Methodism and other evangelical groups. Even among Calvinists, there were debates. John Erskine, a Scottish minister, worked to publish the works of Jonathan Edwards, an American theologian. Erskine agreed with many of Edwards' ideas, but disagreed with his theory of the will. Edwards believed that the will was not a separate faculty, but a part of the mind that chose based on the strongest desire. Erskine, however, thought that faith was purely a matter of the mind receiving supernatural sight from the Holy Spirit, with no role for the will. In England, particular Baptists also had disagreements. Some, like John Gill and John Brine, argued that preaching to unbelievers could undermine God's sovereign plan. But younger ministers like Andrew Fuller and John Ryland Jr. found a way to reconcile their Calvinist beliefs with the need to preach to everyone. They were influenced by Jonathan Edwards' idea that while humans are morally unable to accept the gospel without divine grace, they are not naturally inhibited from hearing it. This led to the formation of the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792, which sent William Carey as its first missionary to India. Despite their differences, many 18th-century evangelicals were influenced by Reformed theology, even if they didn't always credit John Calvin directly. Jonathan Edwards, for example, called himself a Calvinist, but said he didn't believe everything Calvin taught. Other evangelicals, like Thomas Foxcroft and Andrew Fuller, also respected Calvin but didn't consider him infallible. William Wilberforce, a prominent evangelical and abolitionist, described himself as not fully aligned with Calvinism, but still influenced by its teachings. These debates and disagreements shaped the development of evangelicalism in the 18th century, leading to a diverse and sometimes contentious movement. Despite the tensions, the core belief in the sovereignty of God and the need for salvation through Christ remained central to their faith. John Newton, the man behind the famous hymn, "Amazing Grace," had a life that was as wed as the song itself. Before his spiritual awakening, Newton was a slave trader, a profession that would later haunt him deeply. Born in 1725, Newton's early life was marked by a series of tumultuous events. His father was a shipmaster, and his mother, a devout Christian, died when he was just 7 years old. Despite this, Newton's early years were filled with rebellion and a lack of faith. In 1744, at the age of 19, Newton was pressed into the Royal Navy, an experience that only deepened his rebellious spirit. He eventually deserted, but was caught and publicly flogged as punishment. This harsh treatment pushed him further into a life of defiance, and he later joined a slave ship, where he worked as a crew member and eventually became a slave trader himself. During this time, Newton lived a life of debauchery and disregard for the humanity of those he traded. However, two pivotal events changed the course of Newton's life. In 1748, while on a ship called the Greyhound, a violent storm threatened to sink the vessel. Faced with the possibility of death, Newton cried out to God for mercy, marking the beginning of his spiritual journey. He later recounted this experience in his autobiography, an authentic narrative of some remarkable and interesting particulars in the life of John Newton, published in 1764. This storm was the first of two that would profoundly impact him. The The second storm, which occurred a few years later, was equally terrifying. This time, Newton's ship was nearly destroyed, and he again found himself praying for deliverance. These experiences led him to a deeper faith and a commitment to Christianity. Newton began to study the Bible and reflect on his past actions, particularly his involvement in the slave trade. He eventually left the trade and became a tide surveyor in Liverpool, a position that allowed him more time to focus on his spiritual growth. In 1755, Newton met George Whitefield and the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, who were prominent figures in the Methodist movement. Their influence deepened his faith, and he began to study for the ministry. In 1764, he was ordained as an Anglican curate and took up a position in Olney, England. It was here in 1779 that he wrote Amazing Grace, a hymn that has since become one of the most beloved and widely recognized Christian songs in the world. Newton's theological views were complex. While he identified as a Calvinist, he was not entirely comfortable with the more extreme aspects of Calvinist doctrine. He described himself as a middleman, someone who sought a balanced approach to his faith. In his own words, he was a sort of middleman who wanted to avoid the extremes of both Calvinism and Arminianism. He once wrote, "I am what they call a Calvinist, yet there are flights, niceties, and hard sayings to be found among some of that system which I do not choose to imitate." Newton believed in the sovereignty of God and the doctrine of predestination, but he also emphasized the importance of personal faith and the need for a living, active relationship with God. Despite his reservations, Newton's Calvinist leanings were evident in his preaching and writings. He often quoted John Calvin, the 16th century reformer, to support his teachings. For example, in his sermon, The Case of Satan's Fiery Darts in Blasphemous Suggestions and Hellish Annoyances, Newton cited Calvin's advice on how to reject blasphemous thoughts. Similarly, in his funeral sermon for his colleague William Cowper, Newton quoted Calvin to illustrate the unique nature of Christ's humanity and divinity. Newton's journey from a slave trader to a devoted Christian minister is a powerful testament to the Jogam power of faith. His life and work continue to inspire people around the world, and Amazing Grace remains a symbol of hope and redemption. While some evangelicals, like Newton, were comfortable with the label of Calvinist, others were more hesitant. Samuel Davies, a Presbyterian minister in Virginia, preferred to be known simply as a Christian. He believed that his faith was rooted in the teachings of Jesus Christ, not in the doctrines of any one person. In a sermon, Davies stated, "I may indeed believe the same things which Luther or Calvin believed, but I do not believe them on the authority of Luther or Calvin, but upon the sole authority of Jesus Christ, and therefore I should not call myself by their name as one of their disciples, but by the name of Christ, whom alone I acknowledge as the author of my religion, and my only Master and Lord." Similarly, the Anglican clergyman William Romaine often distanced himself from specific denominational labels, even though his beliefs aligned with Calvinism. In his sermon, "Who is this that cometh up from the wilderness, leaning upon her beloved?" Romaine emphasized that the true church transcends denominational boundaries. He said, "The church is neither the Jewish nor the Gentile, neither the Protestant nor the Papist, neither the Calvinist nor the Lutheran." Despite these reservations, many evangelicals found great value in Calvinist doctrines. Jonathan Edwards, a prominent Congregationalist minister, often cited Calvin in his writings, even though he maintained his independence. In his treatise, A Treatise Concerning Religious Affections, Edwards quoted Calvin to support the idea that true spiritual knowledge comes from Scripture alone. Edwards' disciple, Samuel Hawkins, also frequently referenced Calvin in his theological works, particularly in his two-volume systematic theology, The System of Doctrines. For many evangelicals, the doctrines of Calvinism, such as the sovereignty of God and the doctrine of predestination, were foundational to their faith. Hannah Heaton, a farm woman from Connecticut, described the doctrine of predestination as sweet and transporting to the soul because of its promise of eternal blessings for the elect. Gilbert Tennant, a New Light Presbyterian minister, emphasized the importance of Calvinist doctrines in his famous sermon, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry, where he argued that the doctrines of original sin, justification by faith alone, and other Calvinist teachings were essential for genuine faith. Calvin was also celebrated as one of the great heroes of the Protestant Reformation. Samuel Davies in his sermons often referred to Calvin, Martin Luther, and Ulrich Zwingli as key figures who helped free Christians from the shackles of Roman Catholicism. Jedediah Morse, a Congregationalist minister, described Calvin as a celebrated reformer who improved upon Luther's work and set the Protestant faith further apart from Roman Catholicism. In the end, the diverse group of 18th century evangelical Calvinists, despite their disagreements on specific doctrines, shared a common commitment to the core principles of evangelical Christianity. They believed in the need for personal conversion, the sovereignty of God, and the driving power of Christ's death on the cross. Their legacy continues to influence Christian thought and practice to this day. Friedrich Schleiermacher lived in a time when many people were questioning the truth of Christianity. Scholars like Samuel Reimarus and David Hume were challenging the historical and miraculous aspects of the Bible. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and G.F. Hegel were trying to make Christian beliefs fit into rational and philosophical frameworks. Schleiermacher saw that these criticisms were making it hard for people to believe in Christianity, but he also saw that simply defending Christianity with reason wasn't enough. He wanted to find a way to keep faith alive without ignoring the questions and criticisms of the time. Schleiermacher was born in 1768 in a place called Breslau, which is in a region called Silesia. His father was a minister in the Reformed Church, which means he followed the teachings of John Calvin. When Schleiermacher was young, his father joined a religious group called the Herrnhuter Brethren. This group was known for its deep faith and love for Jesus. Schleiermacher was sent to their schools, where he learned about their beliefs and practices. Despite his religious upbringing, Schleiermacher was also very curious and critical. He started reading books that questioned Christian beliefs, especially the works of Immanuel Kant. This reading made him doubt some of the core teachings of his faith, like the idea that Jesus was both God and human, and that his death saved the world. He even wrote a letter to his father saying he couldn't believe these things anymore. This was a big deal because, for the Herrnhuter Brethren, these beliefs were essential. However, Schleiermacher was surprised to find that even though he had doubts about these doctrines, he still felt a deep connection to God and to Jesus. He realized that faith wasn't just about believing certain things. It was about feeling a connection to something greater than himself. This connection was what the Herrnhuter Brethren called the love of God, revealed in the crucified Redeemer. Schleiermacher came to understand that faith is more about a feeling in the heart than it is about specific beliefs or moral actions. This insight was very important for Schleiermacher. He believed that faith should be grounded in a feeling of absolute dependence on God, rather than in specific doctrines or moral rules. This feeling is something that everyone can experience, regardless of their background or beliefs. It's a sense that there is something greater than ourselves, and that we are part of a larger, interconnected universe. Schleiermacher became a minister and a professor, and he spent his life trying to explain this idea of faith. He wrote books and gave lectures that explored the nature of religion and the Christian faith, One of his most famous works is called The Christian Faith, where he explains that the essence of Christianity is not in its doctrines or moral teachings, but in the feeling of absolute dependence on God that it inspires. Schleiermacher also believed that religious communities are important because they help people cultivate this feeling of dependence. When people come together in a community, they can support each other and deepen their faith. He saw the Christian community as a place where people could experience the love of God and grow in their relationship with Jesus. Schleiermacher's ideas were very influential in the development of modern theology. He showed that faith can be meaningful and relevant, even in a world that is skeptical of traditional religious beliefs. By focusing on the feeling of absolute dependence, he provided a way for people to connect with God that doesn't depend on accepting specific doctrines or following strict moral rules. This approach has helped many people find a deeper and more personal connection to their faith. Even in a world that often seems to be moving away from religion, imagine you're walking in a forest, and suddenly you feel a deep sense of being connected to everything around you: trees, birds, the sky. This is what Friedrich Schleiermacher calls the feeling of absolute dependence. It's a feeling that you are part of something much bigger, something that supports you and gives you life. This feeling is different from anything else you know or do. It's not about thinking or acting, it's about feeling. Now, think about when you first realize you're a separate person in the world. You understand that you have a body, thoughts, and feelings, and that there are other people and things around you. This is what Schleiermacher calls sensible self-consciousness. It's the awareness that you are a subject in a world of objects and other people. These two feelings, the feeling of absolute dependence and the sensible self-consciousness, can combine in a powerful way. When they do, you experience a deep sense of joy and connection to the world. Schleiermacher believes that this combination is what gives rise to religious emotions. When you feel absolutely dependent and also aware of yourself in the world, you might feel a sense of blessedness. But if you feel separated from this sense of dependence, you might feel sorrow. For example, if you lose a loved one, you might feel deep sorrow in your sensible self-consciousness. But if you also feel a strong connection to something greater, you might experience a sense of peace or even joy. On the other hand, if you achieve something great in your career, you might feel joy in your sensible self-consciousness. But if you feel disconnected from the feeling of absolute dependence, you might still feel a sense of emptiness or sorrow. When the feeling of absolute dependence becomes strong enough, it can influence how you act and express yourself. You might show your religious emotions through what you say, how you look, and how you behave. Others who share this feeling can recognize these expressions and feel them too. This is how a community of piety forms. People come together, share their religious emotions, and support each other. Schleiermacher believed that the God consciousness often awakens in us through the testimony of others. For example, he had a profound religious experience at a Moravian school when he was 14. He says, "Here it was that for the first time I awoke to the consciousness of the relations of man to a higher world." This shows how the words and actions of others can help us connect with our own religious feelings. A community of piety can be as small as a family or as large as a global community. What holds these communities together is not just shared beliefs or doctrines, but shared religious emotions. For instance, the Christian community is shaped by the religious emotions of Jesus. When people join this community, they share and imitate these emotions, creating a bond that goes beyond just agreeing on ideas. When you join a religious community, you might experience two things at once. First, you might realize that you can't always feel connected to something greater. and this lack of connection feels like a need for redemption. Second, you might feel that the community has a power that can help you overcome this need. In the Christian community, this power is believed to come from Jesus Christ. Schleiermacher says the true Christian faith is the certainty that Jesus can help you overcome your need for redemption. This faith is not about believing in a set of doctrines or following rules. It's about experiencing the influence of Jesus in your life. When you feel this influence, you are participating in the Christian community. The historical Jesus is no longer here, but his influence lives on through the community. People share their experiences of Jesus, and these testimonies help others feel the same way. Schleiermacher believed that the effect of Jesus' influence is the same today as it was when he walked with his disciples. This influence helps people feel a deep connection to God and a sense of being redeemed. For Schleiermacher, Jesus is unique because he had a perfect, sinless connection to God. He was always aware of his absolute dependence on God, and he expressed this awareness in everything he did. This perfect God consciousness is what makes Jesus the Redeemer. When people in the Christian community imitate Jesus' God consciousness, they can experience the same sense of redemption. Schleiermacher explains that Jesus' redemptive work is not about him dying to pay for our sins. Instead, it's about him sharing his perfect God consciousness with others. When people in the community imitate Jesus, they can feel a deeper connection to God and overcome their need for redemption. This influence is what Schleiermacher calls the relatively supernatural work of Christ. It's supernatural because it's unique and powerful, but it becomes natural as it spreads through the community. Schleiermacher compares this to the appearance of a new planet in the universe. Just as a new planet can attract other bodies into its orbit, Jesus' influence can draw people into a deeper spiritual life. This influence is a natural part of the community's life, but it started with a unique and supernatural event, the appearance of Jesus. In the Christian community, the focus is on experiencing the influence of Jesus and sharing this experience with others. This is what makes the community strong and helps people feel a deep sense of connection and redemption. The Princeton Theological Seminary, often referred to as Old Princeton, was a powerhouse of Calvinist theology in the United States during the 19th century. It was a place where some of the most influential theologians of the time, like Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, Archibald Alexander Hodge, and Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, taught and shaped American Protestantism. These scholars were deeply committed to preserving and defending traditional Calvinist beliefs, but they also embraced the latest academic methods from Europe. One of the key figures at Old Princeton was Archibald Alexander, who founded the seminary in 1812. Alexander was well versed in European scholarship and believed that a solid theological education should be grounded in rigorous academic study. He emphasized the importance of understanding the Bible in its historical and cultural context, which was a common approach in European universities at the time. Charles Hodge, who succeeded Alexander, continued this tradition. Hodge was particularly interested in engaging with European scholars and their ideas. He believed that Calvinist theology could stand up to the challenges posed by the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and science over religious tradition. Hodge wrote extensively on topics like the nature of God, the authority of the Bible, and the doctrine of salvation, always grounding his arguments in both Scripture and the latest scholarly research. Archibald Alexander Hodge, Charles Hodge's son, and Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield, who were both professors at Princeton, further developed this approach. They were known for their deep engagement with European theological debates and their commitment to defending the inerrancy of the Bible. Warfield, in particular, was a prolific writer and a respected scholar who engaged with a wide range of theological and philosophical issues. He argued that the Bible was not just a historical document, but a divinely inspired text that provided a reliable guide for faith and life. Despite their commitment to traditional Calvinist beliefs, the Princeton theologians were not isolated from the broader intellectual world. They actively participated in academic networks and dialogues with European scholars. For example, Charles Hodge corresponded with theologians in Germany and the Netherlands, and he often cited their works in his own writings. This engagement with European scholarship allowed the Princeton theologians to refine and defend their beliefs in a way that was both intellectually rigorous and faithful to their Calvinist heritage. The Princeton theologians also faced challenges from other intellectual movements of the time, such as the rise of higher criticism in biblical studies and the growing influence of evolutionary theory. They saw these challenges as opportunities to strengthen their faith and to demonstrate the enduring truth of Calvinist theology. By engaging with these ideas, they showed that their beliefs were not outdated but were still relevant and compelling in a rapidly changing world. The influence of Old Princeton extended beyond the seminary walls. Many of its graduates went on to become leaders in American Presbyterian churches and other Protestant denominations. They carried with them the rigorous academic methods and deep theological insights they had learned at Princeton, helping to shape the direction of American Protestantism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In this way, Old Princeton was a bridge between the traditional Calvinist theology of the past and the academic rigor of the present. It was a place where faith and scholarship went hand in hand, and where the timeless truths of the Bible were explored and defended with the tools of modern scholarship. The story of Princeton Theological Seminary is deeply intertwined with the intellectual currents of the 19th century, a time when the world was changing rapidly. Founded in 1812, Princeton Seminary emerged during a period when new ideas were challenging traditional Christian beliefs. The Enlightenment, a movement that emphasized reason and science, was questioning the foundations of faith, especially the idea of original sin, which had been a cornerstone of Christian doctrine for centuries. In this climate, scholars on both sides of the Atlantic were grappling with how to understand the Bible and theology in a new, more scientific way. European scholars, particularly in Germany, were leading the way in developing new methods of biblical study and interpretation. They were using historical and critical approaches to examine the Bible, treating it as a historical document rather than just a sacred text. This shift was part of a broader movement that sought to reconcile faith with reason and science. Princeton Seminary, located in the United States, was not isolated from these changes. The professors at Princeton, like Charles Hodge, were deeply engaged with European scholarship. They read and translated works by German theologians and historians, and they even studied at prestigious European universities like Halle and Berlin. These experiences shaped their thinking and influenced their teaching. One of the key figures at Princeton was Charles Hodge. He was a bridge between American and European scholarship. Hodge was particularly interested in the work of German theologians who were trying to defend traditional Christian beliefs against the challenges of the Enlightenment. He translated and published works by these scholars, making them accessible to American readers. Hodge's journal, The Biblical Repertory, became a platform for discussing these new ideas and methods. The Princeton professors were not just passive recipients of European ideas. They were active participants in the broader academic community. They engaged with the work of scholars like Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was trying to reformulate Christian theology in a more modern, rational way. Princeton's faculty, however, remained committed to traditional Calvinist beliefs. They used the tools of modern scholarship to defend and explain their faith, rather than to abandon it. This transatlantic exchange was not one-sided. European scholars, like Reinhold Seeberg from the University of Berlin, recognized the contributions of Princeton's faculty. The connections between Princeton and European universities were strong, and they helped shape the direction of American theological education. The influence of European scholarship on Princeton was particularly evident in the areas of biblical studies and hermeneutics. The Princeton professors were interested in understanding the Bible in its historical context, but they also believed in its divine inspiration. They used the methods of historical criticism to explore the text, but they did not reject its spiritual authority. This approach allowed them to engage with modern scholarship while maintaining their commitment to traditional Calvinist theology. The story of Princeton Theological Seminary is a story of how faith and reason can coexist. It shows how a community of scholars, deeply rooted in their traditions, can also be open to new ideas and methods. The professors at Princeton were not afraid to engage with the intellectual challenges of their time. Instead, they used these challenges to strengthen and refine their understanding of the faith they held dear. In the end, the legacy of Princeton Theological Seminary is one of intellectual rigor and theological depth. It is a legacy that continues to influence religious scholarship and education to this day. The connections forged across the Atlantic during the 19th century helped shape a unique approach to theology that remains relevant in the modern world. Princeton's story is a reminder that the search for truth is a journey that transcends borders and generations.